Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Christian Capitalist Podcast. We're so glad to be joined today by Richard Propst from Indianapolis, Indiana. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
And thank you so much for joining us today here on the last day of February. So Puxatawny Phil predicted 6 more weeks of weather. How are things looking in Indiana today, brother?
We are getting a little bit of a break. We were in single digits last week. We're up above 30. So I'm a pretty happy camper right now.
That's awesome. Well, I'm visiting my parents in San Antonio this morning, and it is expected to be in the 80s. There, hope springs eternal, right? It's going to reach you sooner or later.
Wow. I certainly hope so. I can't imagine being in the 80s right now.
No, well, you'll get there, though. You'll get there. Well, man, let me tell you, I'm so glad that you joined us today. We really appreciate you taking time, especially for those of y'all who are watching this later. You can probably see a little blurriness in the eyes here. It is 6:30 Central Time, and we are trying to get an early morning interview in before Richard has a very busy day. But Richard, tell us about a little bit about yourself and the kind of the source of the work that you do for God's kingdom. We want to hear all about it today.
All right. Well, my name is Richard Propst. I'm a lifelong Indiana resident. In 1989, I had reached this point where I had kind of lost everything that a person can lose.
Mm.
My spouse had died by suicide. Our newborn child had died. I lost everything financially. I was really, honestly, in this huge downward spiral. And I made this decision that I wanted. I kind of challenged God, if we're being honest. I said, okay, if I'm going to be here, show me a reason. And so into my head popped this idea to do this 41-day, 1,000-mile wheelchair tour around Indiana. And I guess I should say I am a paraplegic double amputee. I was
Wow.
born with spina bifida, and so this was way outside of anything I had ever done before. And I thought, I wanted to go around the state and just kind of share my testimony, talk to
Mm.
people about what it was like to grow up in a rough childhood and to lose everything. And so I left Indianapolis with 20 bucks in my pocket, a backpack on the wheelchair, a few press releases written on typewriters. That's how long I've been doing it.
Wow.
Uh,
That's
exactly.
great.
And nobody thought I could do it. And I was raising money for Prevent Child Abuse Indiana, and yet that first night I wheeled from Indianapolis to Greenfield, Indiana, which is about 25 miles.
Wow.
And I finished, and I got there. And when I got there, the mayor was out, because they had seen it on television. And I spent the night in a fire station, and it was just a unique thing. And so I kept wheeling, and I kept wheeling, and I kept wheeling. And 41 days later, I arrived back in Indianapolis. I had
Wow.
traveled for 41 days alone in my wheelchair, um, traveled right around 1,086 miles,
Wow.
hadn't raised a whole lot of money, but I had really begun to realize that God did have a purpose for me.
Hmm.
And it was more than I was living into at that point. And so I kind of came back from that first tour knowing that, first of all, I had to get my life together. I
Hmm.
had to get stable. I had to get financially stable, emotionally stable. I had to go into counseling. I had to, find housing, and somehow along the way, you know, that tour, which I called the Tenderness Tour because that's what I was looking for. I was looking for good people in the world. That
Wow.
became kind of my life ministry. And so I've gone out at least once a year, every year for the past 35 years. Um, I'm someone who's pretty, working class in terms of my job and in terms of my, income. But, we've raised over $1 million. We
Wow.
just last
That's awesome.
August, last September, eliminated $17 million in medical debt for Hoosiers um, through, a 150-mile wheelchair tour. And along the way, I just found that not only, you know, I found my own voice, but I also found that there were a lot of people who wanted to be listened to and who had
Yeah.
stories. And
Yeah.
so,
Isn't that wonderful, Richard? In the Episcopal Church, Lutheran, Catholic, and many of the other denominations, we use the Revised Common Lectionary. Last two Sundays have been Jesus' Sermon on the Plain in the Gospel of Luke, where basically he's reiterating the Beatitudes and telling
yeah,
everybody, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry." It sounds like you encountered a lot of people who want to be heard, just like Jesus did in the Sermon on the Plain. That's who he was talking to, the crowd you just described.
exactly. And I think that, sometimes it's so easy. One of the things I love about doing the tour is that, I'm really not, I, I, I hesitate to say I'm not an athlete, but I'm not an athlete. I travel about 2 to 3 miles an hour. I'm slow. I take my time. And the great thing about being in a wheelchair and going at 2 to 3 miles an hour is you don't miss people. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, you're not
I can't,
flying by anybody.
you're not flying by anybody. You can't avoid them. I don't care what color you are, what income you are, what denomination you are. Guess what? I'm going to probably cross your path and I'm going to say hi and we're going to have a really great conversation because that's essentially what I do.
Isn't that wonderful? All right, so Richard, I had a scratch in my throat and I apologize because I think I coughed right during when you told us why you call it the Tenderness Tour. Can you explain that to everybody in a little more detail?
Sure. I grew up, quite frankly, experiencing a lot of abuse and a lot of
Mm,
violence and around a lot of domestic violence. And by that time in my life, when I started it, I really didn't trust that there were good people in the world. I
mm.
didn't, I just hadn't experienced that. And so when I went out, it was tenderness that I was looking for. It was, are there good people in the world? And is there a reason for me to continue? And, and honestly, in some ways, thinking that that's not what I would find, in some
Mm.
ways, people would say leaving Indianapolis in your wheelchair alone with $20 is kind of a suicide mission. And in some ways, it was. It was
Yeah.
really, truly challenging God to say, okay, if I'm here, you're going to have to show me why. And so God proceeded to do that every single city that I went to. I could be in the middle of farmland in Indiana and people would show up with water or they would show up and offer a place to stay, or
Mhm.
it would be the mayor saying, I want to meet with you, or the media, or, any number of people. And I mean, I never went without a place to stay. I never went without a meal. Um, it was nonstop and nothing. I mean, quite seriously, nothing bad happened.
Isn't that
Nothing.
wonderful? In that
Just
first year
amazing.
or in the 35 years after that?
Yeah. The worst thing that has ever happened to me on a tour was that I had a backpack stolen one time.
Good grief. Somebody
I
stole
mean,
the backpack off your wheelchair?
No, and to be honest, it was as much my fault as it was theirs. I had set it down in a store so that I could use the restroom,
Mm.
and when I came back out, it was gone.
It was gone. Oh, brother. Well,
So
Richard, I got to tell you, I can't help but think as you're talking about this tour and having left with just a backpack, at least in year one, and $20, I can't help but think of Jesus sending out the apostles in groups of two and saying, "Don't carry anything with you, just go." And you're going to
yeah,
go to a town and you're going to bring the good news, and they're going to take care of you. And so it sounds like you were looking for tenderness, but you likewise brought it. What was the kind of message that you were talking to people about as you're rolling along?
when I started the tour, I think to be honest with you, I sold the drama a bit. You know how it is. If you go through something really traumatic, you talk about it and you talk about it a little bit and you find common ground and you meet other people who've gone through similar traumas. And then at some point, I began to realize that my message was getting more positive. That
Hmm.
the need to sell the drama wasn't there as much. And that what I really wanted people to see was um, that there was always hope. That I was not supposed to live. My original life expectation was 3 days.
Whoa.
Yeah, my original life expectancy was 3 days, And I mean, my mom was Catholic at the time, and we'd had last rites. Everything was, I mean, I was not going to survive. And then I got transferred to a different hospital. They saved my life. And um, and they still had low expectations. I mean, I guarantee you, as someone who works full time, who owns my own home, who drives, who is an ordained minister, who is a published author, um, nobody would have ever expected any of those things from me.
Yeah.
And so, and that for me is the message. It's I think it really comes down to the people that we encounter in our daily lives. Do we um, see them as being made in the image of God? And I think if we do, then we approach them differently. I think
Absolutely.
the divisions get taken away, the labels get taken away, and we treat them as children of God.
Richard, I love that. As you know, that's central to the message about Christianity and capitalism. The Christian Capitalist, as a book, we start off those first two chapters. We're made in God's image to work, and we're made in God's image to give. And you're a fantastic example of both, brother. I love that. How?
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about the journey itself. We just had a guest on the podcast this past week who's a cab driver from London, a taxi driver, who taught us in detail about this terrific event that he and other London taxi drivers do every year to take sick kids from London over to Disneyland Paris in a big convoy. Just
Oh,
imagine 100 London taxi cabs. Isn't that cool?
I
So
love that.
tell us about the journey. What I have in my mind, frankly, it's like Forrest Gump. Remember that movie where
Uh huh.
towards the end he's just running and he encounters people along the way?
Yeah.
How do you roll a wheelchair like that? I mean, I've never been to Indianapolis, but I imagine as a big city, it's full of interstates. So did you just go back roads?
You know what I did? Okay, it's changed, of course, over the course of 35 years. For the first 7 years, I traveled alone in my wheelchair. I after the first tour, then I went to Chicago. So I did Indianapolis to Chicago. Then I
Wow.
did Indianapolis to Cincinnati. Then I did Indianapolis to Lexington, Kentucky, because I have a lot of family in Kentucky, and so I wanted to do something for them. And then all of this time, I was kind of getting my life together. So I was moving from someone who had been, living on disability, because I had failed my first job, I had failed my first try at college, and so everybody said, "Well, just go on disability." Clearly, that's okay. You have spina bifida. Nobody expects more. But after I had wheeled for 41 days and 1,000 miles, figured it all out, survived it, raised money, I thought, okay, I bet I can do more.
Yeah, I got this.
So I just needed to figure out how to do it. And so I came back from that trip and I got back in college. I found stable housing. I went from, a large college. I went to Indiana University, Indianapolis the first time where I didn't quite make it. But then I came back and I went to Martin University, which is a mostly black private college in Indianapolis, and kind of came under the mentorship of the school's founder, who was Father Boniface Harden. He was this very regal, African American priest who started this school for the adult learner, and they just embraced me and were amazing. And so yeah, I got back in school. I I got stable financially. I went to counseling. I got stable emotionally, got out of that suicidal spiral, and ended up with a job the day after college graduation. Um,
Wow. That's a
I
big
had
thing for anybody. As a parent of a guy who's graduating on May 2nd, knock on wood, good for you.
exactly, I had interned at a hospital, and because we're in Indianapolis, we had a snowstorm one day, and I was the only intern who showed up. And
Wow.
so, day after graduation, I had a job. So, um, I just started getting everything together. And so, what happened in 1996? I decided to do another tour to Chicago, and three of the nurses that I worked with said, "You know what? You would end up a lot healthier and do a lot better if you had a support team." And
Hmm.
so, these three nurses ended up going with me. And
Oh, okay.
so And so every year's end, I couldn't deny it. I came back and I was a lot healthier. I was a lot more effective and rested. So from then on, I've had a support team. I've gotten better organized over the years. I'm better at planning. Let's be honest, computers are easier than typewriters to work with. Uh,
And the internet's easier to get the word out than,
Thank
gosh,
you.
in 1989, what do? Just tack it on a wall, right? Or on
Exactly.
a telephone pole.
It was awful back then. I look back now, I'd go to, Hoosier Motor Club and say, can I have some free maps? And I'd sit there with the paper maps and try to pick cities where I could.
Awesome.
It was fun, but
Well, you mentioned that the TV news was featuring your first Tenderness Tour, and that's how the mayor of Greenfield knew you were coming. How did that happen? Because I imagine in those days, unless you were in PR and knew folks, it's difficult to get a press release out as we would think about it now through the internet. So, can you tell us a little bit about that and how you were portrayed in this first trip?
well, interestingly enough, I was wonderfully naive. I think that was to my benefit because I
Mhm.
typed up these press releases. I looked up the addresses of all the television stations, all the radio stations, and I just sent them press releases. And they weren't in on fancy letterhead. And I think it was just weird enough. I mean, because let's face it, to this day, we don't see a lot of folks in wheelchairs doing long distance events.
On the side of the road.
On the side of the road. In my
Yeah.
case, it's usually state roads or these days I do a lot of trails. Because the trail
Mm-hmm.
systems are growing, and so that makes it
Mm-hmm.
really easy. Because I am getting older, and so
Mm-hmm.
I but back then, it was just I was naive, and so I sent them these press releases, and I think it was just such an incredible novelty that they showed up just to see if it was real, and then they found me there, and it was funny because I had let Prevent Child Abuse Indiana know what I was doing, and they didn't even show up because they thought it was a hoax.
Like, you've got to be kidding me. This isn't real, right?
So, but fortunately, I had chosen to start in front of their office, so the minute they saw me, they were like, "Awesome!"
Listen, Richard, you may have been naive PR wise, but it sounds like you have an instinctive gift for getting into the limelight. That's awesome.
It's funny. I sometimes tell people I'm not the world's best fundraiser, but I am really good at getting attention.
Well, it's funny. I tell people all the time, especially our audience has folks from every age group, right? We got
Hmm.
college kids, we got kids in high school, all the way to seniors who are in retirement communities. But I always think of when it comes to getting attention in the name of the Lord, the guy you'll appreciate this from the 70s and 80s, who always had the rainbow colored wig and the John 3:16 sign, right? He had a knack for
Yeah.
finding where the camera was going to be. Sometimes, you just the
Yep.
Holy Spirit puts you in the right spot.
Yep. Exactly. I had a pastor at one point who used to say, "To us be the applause, to God be the glory." And
Mm.
as long as for me, people see and feel God's presence in this activism that I do, that's what I want. I want them to feel like, you know, this is a ministry, this is a mission, and
Mhm.
and that's very much how I approach it. And I am known for not always going the um, predictable route. I don't always go into the bigger money neighborhoods. Sometimes I'll go into the rougher areas, and I live in a rougher area, and
Mhm.
that's very intentional. I'm very into urban ministry, and yet I
Let's
do
talk.
try to balance that.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
let's talk about that a little bit, both on the tour and how your ministry works now. Because one of our core concepts for the Christian Capitalists is based around the story in the Gospel of the widow's mite, where Jesus tells his apostles, "Hey, look, that woman who gave 2 coins that together aren't even worth a penny gave more than everybody else because that's all she had." How have you
Yeah.
experienced that kind of giving as you're out on the Tenderness Tour?
It's funny. I was just talking to one of my donors yesterday who, shared some things that had been going on in their life and acknowledged that she had supported my last event, which financially was the biggest event I've done. It, they are actually in the process of making a documentary about the Tenderness Tour. And so
Wow.
I had this film crew following me during the last event,
Hmm.
and some of the producers kind of, calling in their networks and their friends, and so I raised a lot more than usual. And but this person didn't give as much as she would have liked to have given, and yet, one of the things I said to her was that her presence for me is so powerful, that what she gave was so profound and so honest and so authentic that it felt like $1 million to me.
Wow.
I mean, and that happens so many times. I have kids who come up to me and want to give. I've had, middle schools where, um, you know, two different middle schools will do penny wars, and I love stuff like that. I really,
Right.
I love grassroots, and um, I think that because so many people would have looked at my life and said, oh well, he's going to live in a group home, or he's not ever going to accomplish anything. I know what it's like to be underappreciated. I know what that's like, and so I know what it's like to have people have low expectations, and
Hmm.
so it's kind of fun, number one, proving them wrong, but also celebrating the people who show up and give $1. Bring it
Exactly.
on. Bring
Exactly.
it on.
As you're talking about, I know what it's like. I know what it's like. I can't help but think of Philippians 4, where Paul kind of sets up one of actually my favorite verse from Scripture. I know what it's like to be hungry. I know what it's like to be in need. I know what it's like to have plenty and have nothing, but I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And you're a terrific example of that, man. Just rolling around the upper Midwest on your wheelchair. I just can't believe it. How has that changed as you've gotten older? I mean, as we have discussed, we're guys from the '70s and '80s. What's that like now that it's getting a little harder to move around?
I definitely have a support team that is a little more physically engaged. Before they would be mostly practical. They would be helping me coordinate visits and get media and do special events, and yes, they don't follow me, but they stay close. But now, they may very well be physically engaged. If I get really wiped out, they may help me do a transfer. They may,
Hmm.
make sure that I look, amazing when I do a speaking appearance, even though, I just wheeled 30 miles and am completely wiped out. Um,
Right.
so there's a stronger physical component. I think that how I used to be really comfortable going on small highways because, I was pretty flexible. I could dodge traffic. I could, go into a ditch if I needed to. If I fell out of the wheelchair, I would just climb back in. But about 5 years ago, I lost my left leg, upper leg. So lost a really strong foundation, and so now it's harder to get back in the wheelchair. And
Yeah.
so now I do a lot of trails. Now I do a lot of very defined paths. My last tour was 160 miles along four of Indiana's bigger trails, and
Isn't
so
that something? Wow.
it's
So
definitely changed.
that's four times your original tour after 35 years. So much for getting shrinking things down as you're getting older, brother. That's quadruple. I love it.
It's funny here in Indiana. They have an award called the Sagamore of the Wabash that the governor gives. It's like
Mhm.
the highest, community service award, and they gave it to me after my 10th anniversary because they thought I was going to retire from wheeling. And so here, 25 years later, I'm still going.
Well, congratulations on that award. And it sounds like you've gotten other awards along the way. Are there any that you've received that are particularly meaningful for our purpose of hard work and given generously?
Um, let's see. I know that Indiana Minority Business Magazine gave me a Champions of Diversity award.
Mm.
That meant a lot to me. Um, so because so many different communities support who I am and what I do, that's really important. And of course, for me, that was a tribute to Father Hardin, who really was my first truly healthy male role model.
Hmm.
Um, let's see, I did win the Donna J. Stone Award, which is Prevent Child Abuse America's highest honor, which also was very meaningful. Um, it's kind of funny when you're young and you're first starting out and you kind of get the awards. It's really cool and you have really a lot of fun with it. And then you realize after a while that all most of my awards are actually sitting on a shelf somewhere.
Right.
I have them. They're important to me. I don't want to disrespect them, and they help spread the news. Let's be honest.
Exactly.
Um, but it's the mission. It's the people for me that come up to me and say, "You changed my life," or "Your book changed my life," or um, the fact that they see this guy in a wheelchair out on the road or out on the trail gives them hope for their loved one who is in a wheelchair and feeling defeated. So
I love that,
those are the
Richard.
things.
I love that. It's so funny that you just mentioned the word mission. I'm in San Antonio this morning visiting my parents, and later on today, after our interview, I'm doing a presentation called Christianity, Capitalism, and the San Antonio Missions. And so,
Oh
as you've
wow.
been talking, I've been thinking about the missions, which here were started by Franciscan monks and, of course, representatives from Spain and set up all along the San Antonio River and are very much now a part of modern San Antonio, this big metropolitan area. How would you describe, because you kind of hit around it just now, how would you describe your mission sitting here in 2025?
I did it. I did a podcast recently, um, actually with my pastor, and for me, my mission is simple: show up, listen, and love. That's my mission,
That's
and
beautiful.
that gets expressed in different ways with different tours and different events. In addition to the wheeling, I've done that. I've written the book. I've produced plays. I've supported people who needed to have that. I supported one person in um, doing a theatrical show about addiction. He wanted to combine his healing path with humor and with his recovery, and so I just put up the money. I mean, it was and I'm fortunate that God has, I would not say that I'm wealthy, but I'm rich enough that I can do things like that. And so
Exactly.
for me, I have an obligation to do that.
Well, and
You don't
wonderful,
get
wonderful example where you started off with $20 in your pocket in 1989, and now you're
Yeah,
in a position where you can not only have been the recipient, but now you can give generously. I just love that.
I love that. It's one of my favorite things in the world, and I do believe that we're called to do that. It's like you say, you do work and you give, and that's what you do. And I mean, that's one of the reasons I really resonated with your book because I thought that's to me what I'm fortunate. I was raised by a good old Kentucky country boy who was a workaholic, who was a carpenter, who was pretty much working class his entire life, and never really allowed me to have excuses. Even if it was going to be volunteer work my whole life, I was expected to have a meaningful life. And so, um, the idea, when I started off on disability, I hated it. And I'm not disrespecting anybody who has to be on disability. I'm glad as a nation that we have that. But for me, I really wanted to live differently. I wanted to see what I could do, how I could do it. And my life is so far beyond anything I'd ever, I am the director of provider services for the state of Indiana's Bureau of Disability Services. I'm literally director of provider services for an agency that serves people with my same diagnosis.
Isn't that something? And what a
I,
great role model for people with your same diagnosis. I
exactly,
mean,
exactly.
if I can do it, you can do it, right?
Yeah. And so many times I think when you grow up with a disability, so many times you're told what you can't do and you're not told what you can do. And so I'm here to tell you what you can do
Right. And in many ways, God is showing you what you can do.
and, and showing me new stuff all the time.
So tell us how you got to be an ordained minister. I love that.
I started off, to be honest with you, I was actually raised a Jehovah's Witness.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it's which I don't recommend, by the way. But sorry.
Hey, fair enough. No, listen, these are all personal. These are all personal choices.
It was kind of funny because my mom. Of course, I was born. I wasn't supposed to live. M- My mom's priest made the mistake of saying that it was God's will that I would die. That it had to
Ooh,
be God's will. Well, my
come
mom
on,
didn't.
man.
She didn't. I think he. I'd like to think he meant well, and he just phrased it poorly.
Yeah.
But it stayed with my mother, and so she left the Catholic Church. And the punchline being that she then became a Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah, that's quite a move.
Great decision making, Mom. Thanks. Um, but but no, that so I did all of that, and then I got out of that in my late teens when I could start making my own decisions, and really started exploring it, and had that dysfunctional religion experience, and so really knew that I still believed, I still had faith, and I needed to figure out what that faith was. And I had been preaching since I was 8 years old, even with the witnesses. And so
Wow.
I loved preaching. I loved church. And I thought, okay, let's pursue this. And so there was a non-denominational church in Indianapolis where I did some study, and they ordained me. And then um, I kind of bounced around a little bit. Currently, I actually was just ordained as a deacon in the Presbyterian church.
Okay,
And
congratulations. That's great.
thank you. That was like 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
Um, so literally brand new.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so I've
What is
always
that?
viewed.
I'm sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. I was just going to say. I mean, I've always kind of viewed everything that I do through that lens of surrendering to how God wants to use me,
Yeah.
even if it makes no sense whatsoever. God tells me to build an ark, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
So it'll be a short ark because I'm a double amputee, but I'll build the ark.
Right. Exactly. It'll be an arc with definitely with a ramp, right?
Exactly. It will have that ramp for sure.
That's awesome. All right, well, let me ask you a question. I want to get into your kind of with the new ordination as a deacon. I want to ask
Mhm.
you what the duties of a Presbyterian deacon are like. And as I ask that question, I can't help but think about where we, Christendom, the church with a capital C, got the role of deacons. And so I want to ask you a little bit about the economics of capitalism and how we give to those who are in need. But first, let's start with Presbyterian deacon. What does that mean for you?
Well, I'm still learning what that means since it's so brand new, but and it was completely unexpected. I had been a Church of the Brethren pastor for a while. I'd been an interim minister. I'd been children's pastor. I'd done pastoral care. Um, but things change, and so I think as a Presbyterian deacon in my church, they have like three committees that you can serve on. One is very specific to the holidays, one is very specific to the congregation, and one is very specific to the community. And I am assigned to that, dedicated to the community.
That makes sense.
So yeah, exactly. I mean, and I do think that a lot of it came about because the church had been very supportive of my last tour, and I think it was the first time where they really, because I found this church when I was going through a hard physical time, and I was just really impressed that when I was in the hospital, they were always showing up even before I was a member, and so they really modeled what I believe a church should be and what a faith community should be. So, so for me, a lot of what I will be doing is devoting myself to, various activities that we do that are very facing the community, whether that's, blood drives or um, we do a lot with a group called Family Promise, which is, those who don't have homes. We do a lot with Super Bowl of Caring. Uh, so a lot of community type events, a lot of school events. Um,
I
so
love
I'm
that
pretty
Super
excited about.
Bowl.
I'm excited about it.
Super Bowl of caring. So it sounds like this is the end of February. We just had the Super Bowl 2 or 3 weeks ago. What was the Super Bowl of caring about?
It was a food drive. It is a food drive. So essentially, soup. And so, you know,
Right.
getting canned goods, fresh goods. My church also does have a food pantry, so they do that, and we have a lot of land, and so we do gardening, and you
Oh,
know,
that's great.
yeah, yeah,
By the way, that reminds me, we're going to put a ton of show notes, links to websites based on our discussion today in the show notes after this. So tell us the name of your church, and make sure we put a link there, especially to the Super Bowl of Caring.
cool. It is Second Presbyterian Church in Indianapolis.
Second Presbyterian. That's awesome. All right, so now we're going to float back up to the macro level. You ready for some big picture thinking?
I'm ready.
All right. So you, of all the people that I've talked to so far after writing The Christian Capitalist, are one of the few people who can give us insight into what it's like to give to the poor and needy from a centralized government perspective and
Hmm.
from a church-based perspective. So I'm going to set the table on this a little bit, Richard. You know all of this, but I want to make sure our audience is on the same page with us.
Okay.
In Acts chapter 4, Peter and his disciples are setting up a community outside of Jerusalem, and it's terrific because everyone lived together in love and in harmony, according to Luke in Acts. And they gave according to their abilities, and then Peter and his leadership team, Peter then gave back according to their need, and all of this worked very well, and the community continued to grow until it didn't. And then Peter finally says, when representative they were all Jewish, of course, but a representative of the Greek widows, the Hellenists, came to him and said, "This isn't right. Our widows aren't getting as much as the Jewish widows from Jerusalem," and started kind of yapping at him and saying that centralized distribution of these goods wasn't being fairly done. And Peter said, "It's not up for us to wait on tables. The apostles and I need to be preaching the gospel. Let's have some deacons." And so they ordained the first deacons, including Stephen and the other six. So you are in a very unique perspective to talk to us about what that's like, both the benefits and maybe the disadvantages of having a government-based assistance program versus an assistance program based on the church and based on love. So what do you think about that? Because that's one of our big things in obviously in the name Christian capitalist is that we're advocates for capitalism, not socialism. But what do you
Hmm.
think about that? Have you had a chance to reflect on that in your dual roles?
And I think I also have that perspective of being someone who was on disability
Oh
and
yeah, of course.
who spent the first few years of my life receiving those benefits, and quite frankly finding I didn't really like it. I didn't, I didn't want an institution telling me how I was going to live and what I could do and how much I could make. And one of the things with being on disability is that you can only make a certain amount of money, and then the benefits start to withdraw. And
Mhm.
I just found all kinds of things frustrating about that. And so that certainly was part of my motivation. And I think for me, the things that keep coming back is that the Bible tells us that, and I wish I were as good at quoting scripture as you are. You're kind of actually awing me right now, for the record.
I thank you. I appreciate that.
So,
As
but
somebody who's ordained in the Episcopal Church, we're not known for that, so I appreciate that.
it's impressive. It's impressive. But we do not. It goes back to, okay. We know that we're supposed to work, and we know that we're supposed to give. Now, for me, working is flexible. You are going to have the people who work 40 hours a week. You're going to have the people who make $1 million, $100,000. You're going to have people who work for minimum wage. That's just the way, to me, we're set up. But I think for me, where I think life is meant to have the balance of all of it. I mean, I love that we have a government that offers support and hopefully equips us. I will always be grateful for my years on disability because they gave me time to figure it out. They gave me time to get equipped to do, because I wasn't raised to survive. When I got out of high school, I didn't even have a basic life skills. I didn't know how to do laundry. I wasn't even great at showering, if I'm being honest. You could be
Wow.
around me and I had a serious funk. And, you know,
as
and it's
only teenage boys can.
you know, and it's hard to hold a job when you have that funk, you know,
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
don't know what to do. And so, you know, it gave me time to get my life together, and that's wonderful. And I do think that we are, as a society, supposed to protect our most vulnerable. I just I think as Christians, whether it's the government, the church, us as people, that's what we're supposed to do. And so for me, because I've had the perspective of all the different, you know, of government, of church, of me, um, that's the answer. It's for me is the balance of it all.
yeah.
You know, I think the government has a role there, but I think the church has a role. And when we read the Bible, sometimes we we tend to other it, you know, like, oh, well, you know, we're called to give. Well, yes, you and I,
Right.
you know, it's not
Exactly. Not
always
just that
about,
guy.
not that organization over there, not that government agency. We are called to give and love one another and serve one another and work and give. And yes, guess what? Sometimes it hurts, you know.
Yeah,
Uh, I mean,
yeah.
sometimes you give, I don't know if you've had those occasions where, you know, you're walking down the street and you got $20 in your pocket and you see some need and you hand over that $20. I mean, and those of us who take that call to give seriously have certainly done that.
Well, we sure
And
have. You know, it's so funny you say that, brother, because time and time again in this project, I encounter people who say, so there I was, and I had $1 or $20 or five in my pocket, and someone came to me and asked for it, and I gave it to them. I took that leap of faith. And then
mhm.
next thing you know, I have plenty. I live in abundance. Have you experienced that or had people experience that you've worked with?
Certainly I have. I mean, I am pretty much in awe of my life. I mean, yes, I could. I mean, I never drink. I think you know how every parent wants their child to be more successful. So that point where I reached a salary where I made more than my parents ever did was just amazing,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and, and to be able to accomplish things that, in my immediate family, I was the only college graduate, and yet I was, at one point they told my parents to put me in a group home. And for the record, I graduated with Summa. So I was
Awesome.
valedictorian.
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
like,
That's awesome. Good for
I
you,
mean,
Richard. Hey, tell us a
yes.
little bit. I want to loop back to that as we start to wind up our discussion. Tell us a little bit about Father Boniface. I can't help but think that having a mentor like that, whose name literally is a representation of the glory of God, got you set on the right path from an early age. Can you give us a little more insight into mentorship like that? Because I have a feeling that what you're going to tell us will encourage others who listen to this to take on a mentorship role or to seek one.
Yeah, Father Hardin, he was this older civil rights era African American priest who had the long gray beard. So he looked the part. And he actually looked like Frederick Douglass
Oh,
and
wow.
actually did one man shows as Frederick Douglass. Um,
That's so cool.
the archdiocese here in Indy actually gave him the college trying to shut him up, you
Mm.
know, because he was just a loud activist. And so, and he, he and I just hit it off immediately. And, I kind of stumbled by Martin University. Um, I was looking for an option. I wanted to try college again, and I really felt like I needed a smaller school. And this Martin was and is a smaller school. And I met Father Hardin, and he knew about my trauma background. He knew about my disability. Martin was not the most logical choice because at the time it was in this old elementary school
Oh,
with
wow.
3 floors, no elevator. So, I would go in there and I would jump out of my wheelchair and I would carry my wheelchair up and down the stairs to go to my classes. Um, Now they have lifts now, but
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. I guess
it,
those were in the days before the ADA, right?
it was, and it was in the early days of Merton too. So, Um, so he really identified with my perseverance and um, my willingness to just do whatever it was going to take for me to get that college degree. And one of the great things that happened with Father Hardin, I had been a C plus student in high school. I was very average, but at Merton, they figured out how I learned, that I was an experiential learner. And so if instead of sitting down and taking a test, I could actually like write a play about
Oh, wow.
what I knew, um, and it would reveal everything. And so they started adapting how they taught me, and Father Hardin was instrumental in that, and he was instrumental in really modeling what it meant to be a healthy male, what it meant to love, um, what it meant to um, be responsible to the community, you know, and the hospital that I had grown up in, had largely been a lot of, it was a county hospital, so there were a lot of black nurses, a lot of black CNAs. My whole life, I have been tremendously influenced, cared for, nurtured, equipped by the black community. To this day, I live in the black community. And Father Hardin he nonstop changed my life. And a great story. After 9 years, the hospital that I was working with, the one where I got the job after graduation, closed. Well, I went a few months, struggled to get, because being disabled and finding work can be a little difficult. About 3 months in, Father Hardin invites me to come and speak to the professors. They were going to have a staff meeting. Come and speak. You have a great story. I'm thinking, oh, finally, I get to give back to Martin. This is awesome. I show up. I do my thing. I speak. I inspire. As I'm leaving, he hands me an envelope with enough money to pay the mortgage that saved my house.
Wow.
And I mean, literally saved my house. Had no idea he was going to do it. And about a month and a half later, I had a new job. So, I mean, literally, he got me through that. And that was Father Hardin. I mean, it was
Isn't that
just
something?
work and give and work. I mean, it's
Work and given, and something that you experienced both as a giver and a recipient. Isn't that
exactly.
wonderful?
It's just amazing. Yeah.
Glory to God. Well,
Amen.
tell us a little bit about the plays that you write now. Are you still doing that?
Um, the
With the plays that you have written, tell us a little
oh,
bit
okay.
about those.
I do a lot of writing. I actually largely do film journalism right now. I am a film critic. I run the independentcritic.com, which I started about 15 years ago. I had been a drama minor in college, even the first time when I didn't, make it through IU. I I had been a drama minor. Things went well. I loved it. Got stage experience, but then I became an amputee, and I was like, you know what? I'm probably not going to make a living.
Hmm.
I'm in Indianapolis, you know, and at that time, film and stage were not real open to the disabled. It's getting a lot better. But, about 15 years ago, I started writing again. And so I wrote my book, The Hallelujah Life. I started
That's
writing film
beautiful.
reviews. Yeah. And I am a member of the Indiana Film Journalists Association. And you can find my reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. So I'm
Okay.
it's one thing I do where I actually have a lot of readers, and actually that's kind of how I came across your book. Was I was branching out into doing some book reviews, and I'd actually gone to a church that did a series on Harry Potter, and I had never read the books. So
Oh,
I decided to sit down with them and read them while the series was going on, and I was like, you know what, I miss reading. So I did that. I've had 4 plays produced. I don't write plays a lot anymore.
okay.
I really focus a lot on my film reviews and my film work, and but it is nice. Definitely, a strong creative streak is very much alive. And I actually graduated with a minor in theater. So,
Isn't that something? And by the way, thank you for your book review. We appreciate that, and and are delighted that you enjoyed the book and had a chance to review and reflect on it. Tell us a little bit about this documentary that you've got going on. Is what's that going to be like, and where can people watch it?
Um, it's not out yet. It is going to be called the Tenderness Tour, at least right
Mhm.
now, and we are still in production. I'm actually doing a weekend of filming at the end of March, but it's kind of winding down. And what happened was a couple of years ago. Well, let's see, in 2023, um, I had both bladder and prostate cancer, and so I had an extended.
Goodness gracious, Richard. You're like a human punching bag. Wow.
In some ways, it does feel like that at times. Um, but um, but I made it through. I survived it, and because I survive everything. Um,
I was going to say, do you believe in the cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger?
I am pretty strong. My doctor was baffled that I chose to celebrate my 1 year cancer free by going out on a tenderness tour and wheeling 160 miles.
Take that, Doc.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
but
great.
after that, what had happened is I don't know if you've heard of the Heartland International Film Festival. It
Mm.
is a Indianapolis-based film festival. It's an Academy Award qualifying festival
Oh, wow.
that celebrates the power of cinema to make a difference in the world.
Mhm.
A very popular film fest, and they present an award in my name, the Richard D. Probst Social Impact Award. And I about a month after getting out of the hospital from the cancer, I showed up at the award ceremony to present the award. And as one might expect, I was a little more emotional than usual. Uh, and
Sure.
somebody went from that and read my book and said, "How has this guy never had a documentary?" And so they approached me, and I don't like to be filmed a lot, so I was somewhat hesitant. But this was a group of people that I trusted, and then they ended up recruiting a director that I know very well, and so um, they just decided they were going to do a tour. And then, of course, I decided myself if we are going to do a tour about the tour, we should do a tour.
It
So,
makes sense.
and and because I had just dealt with medical expenses. And for the first time in my life, because I was homeless twice in my 20s because of medical bills. And for the first time in my life, I had insurance, I had a decent income. I wasn't worried about losing everything.
Yeah,
To go through two types of cancer and not be worried about losing everything was amazing. And I thought,
sure.
I want everyone to have that feeling. Nobody should lose everything because of medical debt. That's just not acceptable to me. So we decided to make it about medical debt. And
Isn't that something? So, Richard, I'm so glad you mentioned that as we draw our discussion today to a close, because you mentioned at the outset of our conversation today that you'd raised $1 million to help fight medical debt. Tell us about that and how that works now.
actually, I raised 117,000, but that
Okay.
117,000, what they can do, I worked with a nonprofit called Undo Medical Debt, and
Okay.
what they do is they take the collection approach. They buy medical debt in bulk, and because they can do that, they get it for pennies on the dollar. And
Mm.
so they say that for about every $100 donated, um, no, I'm sorry, for every dollar donated, they can eliminate $100 in medical debt. So I raised around 117,000, just under 117,000, and so I was expecting maybe around 11 million in medical debt, but it was a big enough donation that they could really get a good deal, and so we ended up eliminating just under $17 million in medical debt
Wow.
um, for Indiana. I had focused on the Hoosier State at that point, so.
Mhm.
Um, and I will be doing another tour this year. I turned 60 this year, and so one of my goals is going to be which by the way just blows my mind, but one of the
Unbelievable.
things I'm going to try to do is get us to 60 million dollars in medical debt eliminated. That's my
I
goal.
love that. And when is the tour scheduled for this year? Just so we can start promoting it for you.
I'm not 100% sold, but I think it's going to be in early July. I think it's going to be early. We did it in like around mid-September last year, and it worked well, but it kind of conflicts because I'm also the founder of a 5K event here in Indy called the Race Away from Domestic Violence,
Mhm.
and so I'm very devoted to it, and I want to make sure that I give it the time it needs. But so
Sure.
I'm thinking it'll be mid-July, and then I think from basically from April to October I'll be fundraising. My birthday's October 1st. My goal is to hit the 60 million by then.
That's wonderful. And let me just tell you, here at the Christian Capitalist Project, we have a lot of different approaches for how to spread the good news, the gospel of hard work and giving generously. The podcast, the book, through social media. We're launching a newsletter in March, and the focus of the newsletter is supporting charitable events for the coming quarter. So it's going to be a 4 times a year newsletter, supporting charitable events for the guests of our podcast and people that we know through the project. Thank you for supplying us for the entire second quarter of the year. I appreciate that.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
You're like a one-man promotion for various charities. I love that, man. That's awesome. Hey,
Thank you.
all right. So listen, thank you so much for joining us today. I promised you a hard stop at an hour, and so I want to draw our time to conclude. It's flown by like that, and
Yeah.
I've so enjoyed discussing with you today. So, kind of our signature question here on the podcast is, what does it mean to you to be a Christian capitalist? And so, I'd love your thoughts on that to kind of summarize our discussion today.
Boy, you're just going to end with the toughest question.
Sorry, I didn't mean to, but you've hit all around it for the last hour.
I mean, I think you summarize it so well. I mean, obviously, your book is The Christian Capitalist. I mean, I think for me, it's genuinely we work for the glory of the God. We work for the glory of God. We give for the glory of God. We serve one another, and we love one another for the glory of God.
Amen. That's mic drop. Richard, thank you so much. I sure appreciate that. And what a succinct way to summarize not only our conversation today, but the mission of our work. And I'm so glad. I love the way that you rephrased your mission earlier. Show up, listen, and love. Words to live by. And I hope you have a great day. God bless you. Good luck, and God bless you. We'll certainly be in touch with you before the next Tenderness Tour, and hope that you have springtime soon coming up.
Awesome. Thank you
The
so
sun
so
will
much for
shine
this
for you.
opportunity. All
My
right.
pleasure, sir. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon on the Christian Capitalist.
Awesome. Thank you.